Now let's talk about another really cool new feature, which is Bevel Pro. We're going to start out simple, and in fact, I'm going to use the same shape that Paul does, which is basically going to my simple brush here. We're going to grab a Spherender 3D, drag it on our canvas, go into edit mode, and this is a polymesh primitive, so I go in here to initialize. I can change this coverage down, so it looks like a little Pac-Man. We'll just type in 270 or so, and then now that we have the shape we want, we're going to go up here to Make Polymesh 3D, click that, and now we have a fairly controlled polygonal object. And I'm going to go in here to my materials. I'm going to say Skin Shader 4 so we can see a little bit better. Now, in order for Bevel Pro to work, we need polygroups. And how to polygroup this up is actually pretty easy. We can go right down here into the polygroup submenu, and there you're going to see a group by normals. You can change this max angle down, but honestly, if you just click that button, it'll go through, and any angle change on your object, it'll go ahead and give it a new polygroup. Now, you may already know this exists. So if we go in here to Geometry, Crease, there is a bevel width in here, and if you hold down Control while you drag this, that'll actually give you bevels in between your polygroups. However, I mean, it works pretty well, but again, this is a very controlled object, pretty nice evenly spaced geometry, but it fails right down the middle here. You see where it kind of just goes through and overlaps that geometry, so not ideal. Now, what we want to do is add a bevel all across every single one of these polygroups, and an easy way to do that is with Bevel Pro. And Bevel Pro's amazing. It will do much more complicated things than what we're showing here with much worse geometry, but this is where we're going to start. So hang in there, it's going to get spicier. So let's go in here to our ZPlugin menu. I'm just going to click and drag this over here. You're going to see Bevel Pro is an option. Click it, and this is going to open up, and this is going to use your GPU. So it's going to open up in a different window. However, all the same ZBrush navigation still applies. You know, you just move, scale, and rotate. Or move your camera around and pan just as you navigate in ZBrush. So, and just to make sure, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to hit reset just to make sure this shows up pretty much how it should for you. But right up here, you're going to see you can save, load, and reset your settings. So if you dial in settings that you like, go up here and save it, and then you can load those up whenever you'd like if you're going to be doing similar beveling with similarly scaled objects. Now, if we zoom in here, you're going to see some blue and some red and some pink in here. These are actually changeable. You can go down here to display colors. You can see you can change the mesh color in here, edges, amount, and filling, but we're going to talk about what these things are. The first one up here that we're going to talk about is the Bevel Amount. This is going to be the width of your bevel, basically, and that's going to be this light pink area. So if we go in here to the Bevel Amount, you can click on here and you can type in like 0.2, enter, 0.3, enter, and you can start seeing these things change, or maybe 0.25, enter, or you can simply grab this slider and just dial it in here. So again, we'll say, you know, maybe 0.448, or again, if you want to type it in, it's going to automatically highlight it for you, but if you need to, you can just go and click the number and it'll say 0.2, enter. And again, that's going to control the bevel width. Now up here, you're going to see it kind of starts falling apart a little bit, and it may be difficult for you to understand, like, is it working, is it not working? All I see is, you know, light pink. What you can do is you can go down here to auto apply, and this auto apply is going to have another function that we're going to talk about in a bit, but one way you can use auto apply in this scenario is you click on it and you're going to see a preview of what your bevel is going to end up looking like back in ZBrush once you hit this OK button. But before we do that, you can see there's kind of it's not quite going through all of the mesh. So if we turn on auto apply, you can still, this is actually even clearer in this view. So how we fix that is this mesh offset amount. This is how thick that bevel is going to be applied to your object. It may sound a little bit abstract right now, but I'm going to be able to show you exactly what's controlling that offset amount in just a second. So for the mesh offset, if we go from 0.4 maybe up to 0.6, you're going to see it's going to go ahead and fix that. It just makes that bevel thicker. And then again, if we turn on auto apply, we get a nice bevel. You're also going to notice it doesn't have the same issue that we had with the other method. So we're getting a nice bevel along here, and then we have an interior bevel along here, the exact same width. So everything's working out awesome. If I go out of auto apply again, the blue line is your polygroup border. So everywhere we had a polygroup is going to be represented by a blue line here, and then your red points here. And I can actually show you over here underneath display color. So here again, we can change the mesh display. We'll just keep that at a light gray. Our edges here you're going to see is that blue. Those are our polygroup edges. So if you want to change the color of that, you can. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it at blue. The amount, the bevel amount, is indicated here in red. Of course, you can change this to any color you'd like. On the color wheel, we'll go ahead and just keep it with red. That's kind of the thickness of your bevel. And then that filling here, which is indicating the result of your bevel. And of course, you can change that to any color you'd like, but we'll just leave it at pink. So now, how do we go back into ZBrush with these bevels? Well, two ways to do that. One is if you hit auto apply, you can go back into ZBrush, and what you see right here is what you're going to see in ZBrush. It's going to apply a Boolean mesh, and there you go, you'll have it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off auto apply so I can do that manually and show you a little bit more ZBrush functionality. So turning off auto apply, dialing in the bevel amount that we want, or thickness that we want, we can hit OK. And we go back in here, it's going to look a bit weird and hash. That's because we have polyframe turned on, because I was showing you where the polygroups were. But if we turn that off, you're going to see we get a really nice bevel result. You'll also notice we have live Boolean turned on. So it turns that on by default. If you don't have that on, you'll start seeing geometry. So what's happening here is if we go into Subtool, if you know the basics of Booleans, and we'll do a quick refresher right now, you have your first object up here. If we go into solo mode, this is just our original object sitting here. On top of this, you're going to see we have another object, and again we're still in solo mode, so you have basically an additive. So this little first shape right here says additive, subtractive, and union. It's going to add a bevel right along the middle there to kind of fill in that concave bevel here. And then over here you have this one set to subtractive. If we go into solo mode, it's basically generating this geometry, which is then being applied as a subtractive Boolean, which is giving us this result. Now this is a live Boolean, so it's mesh is live. If you go into your move brush and you start moving this mesh around, in fact, if we turn on polyframe, you can see I'm moving the actual mesh it's generating around, and it's going to change that cut. Or I can go down here to maybe our deformation menu and just run an inflate, and we can inflate that geometry out so you can see it's updating on the fly. It hasn't been applied to my geometry yet. In order to do that, what we can do is, with all these visible, we can go down here to Boolean. We can say make Boolean mesh. That's going to put a UMesh out in our scene. And now if we go to polyframe, I don't have any more subtools, and they've all been applied. So that Boolean that was like non-destructive has now been, cut into our actual geometry here. And if we want to go back, all we got to do is see this little 3 right here. This is our original mesh with 3 subtools total. Here's our additive, here's our subtractive. We can turn off polyframe. So again, you can keep it non-destructive with your Booleans if you'd like, or if we want to, we can say, you know what, let's delete that subtool here, and we're going to delete this subtool, and we're going to go back to our original shape. I'm going to hop back into Bevel Pro, and when we do that, you're going to see it's going to retain all of our original settings here before we hopped in. Of course, if you want to reset it, you can. And now what we can do is, like, you know what, that bevel amount, I want to up this to 0.906. That's perfectly fine. And then this time I'm going to hit auto apply, and now I'm going to say, well, let's do this. Let's go into preview edges, and now you're going to see you can preview the geometry that you're going to get when you go back into ZBrush. In fact, it's just something I should mention as well. If I turn off auto apply, you see where the red dots are and the blue dots are? That's actual geometry. You're going to see as this geometry comes around, it ends in a red dot. And then through here, you got a bunch of red dots in here. That's actually looking at your geometry and telling you, hey, you're going to get a line right here, because essentially that's where your geometry is. Same thing with the blue line that's indicating your polygroup. Wherever you have geometry coming through, it's giving you a blue dot. Now, as far as the mesh edge resolution, it's set to 4 by default, and as you can probably guess, that's controlling this resolution in here. So we go through here and we crank this all the way down to 1. There we go. We're just going to get 1 cut in here. If we put it up to 2, of course you can type this in, or you can drag the slider here. You can set that to whatever you'd like. So we'll set this back to 4. We have mesh preview turned on, and this time we're going to turn on auto apply. So when we have this button on and we hit OK, instead of having to go through and do what we did previously, which was make Boolean mesh, this one does it for you. It's a little more destructive. It's basically sitting here already Booleaned and already ran, but if you're not looking to keep those other meshes around, this might be the better option for you. If you ever decide, you know what, that wasn't exactly what I wanted, and I hit auto apply, just hit Control Z to undo, go back into Bevel Pro, make any additional changes that you want, maybe go back down to 0.5. Now you can hit auto apply again, hit OK, and there you go. You've got your new bevel geometry applied. All right, so on a controlled or semi-controlled geometry, still pretty hefty though. This isn't necessarily low res, but it was a little bit more controlled. It seemed to work fine. So let's beat this geometry up a little bit more. I'm gonna hit Control Z to go back to our original shape here. And you can see I have some faceting on the top If I go out of, well, let's go back into startup material. So if I want to get rid of that, one thing I can do is I can go down here to my geometry crease, and I'm going to say crease PG. Then I'm going to hit Control D or hit divide once, and that'll give me a nice subdivision. So I got nice, smooth geometry results. Now, let's say I want to go through and Dynamesh this. So again, if I turn on my polyframe, we'll go back to our skin shader and we go into geometry, Dynamesh. I'm going to crank this resolution up just a bit, maybe to 280-ish, and then hit the Dynamesh button. I don't want to freeze transformation, so I'm going to hit no. And now I've got a Dynamesh mesh. We're sitting at 250,000 points over here. If I go through here, you can see our line is a little bit, you know, this isn't a great polygroup. It's kind of all over the place here. And like we mentioned before, it's a Dynamesh, but we still have polygroups in place. So even though it's heavy and even though our polygroup isn't necessarily clean, we can still use Bevel Pro. And that's kind of the power of Bevel Pro, is it's not reliant on just nice clean geometry, because you can bevel that. This will bevel almost anything. So if we go back into Bevel Pro and we take a look at what it's going to do, let's go ahead and turn off preview edges here. You're going to see some problems. So number one, you're going to see our middle line that's indicating our polygroup border. It's all over the place. It's really kind of janky. Another thing too is you're going to see our mesh offset amount. It's allowing some of that gray to poke through from our mesh. So that's not great. One really easy way to fix this though is right up here, this very first option is polish by groups. So if you have a polygroup that just wasn't that great, and Dynamesh would be notorious for giving you that result, you can go up here, polish by groups, just crank that up, let that run, and that's literally going to go through and polish that polygroup border. So here you can see much cleaner result. If we go in here to auto apply, you're going to see what that geometry is going to look like, and boy, that did a great job. I didn't notice how much polish by groups I put in there, but you can do less or more just by how much you grab that slider in there. So now we go down here to preview edges, and you know, again, you can go say mesh resolution maybe down to 2, less resolution on here. And again, it's giving you the geometry based on the geometry you currently have. So again, we had 250,000 points over here that's generating how dense these lines are, but we control how dense it is from this direction. So again, you can set this to whatever you'd like. If we have auto apply, we're not going to get those booleans, so we can go ahead and say okay. And now our Dynamesh mesh has beautiful, pristine bevels along this shape. So again, even though it was nasty Dynamesh geometry, we were still able to use Bevel Pro and get out of some nasty situations with smoothing by groups. And if I can show you the manual way, basically what it's doing is you can go down here, deformation, you have polish by groups right here, so you can just crank that up and that'll go ahead and again polish your polygroup border. You can do closed circle to maintain your volumes. You can do open circle to really polish the heck out of your object here. So you could do it manually if you'd like. And in fact, polish by feature, a feature is basically a polygroup border or a crease. So either one, you can polish by features to smooth this up as well before you head in, but it's also built into Bevel Pro, so you can have it handle it for you. Now let's use some booleans of our own, and we'll also talk a little bit about masking. So if I go in here to subtool, you're gonna see this is the only object we have. If we go in here to B as in brush, I to narrow it down the IMM brushes, and then you're gonna see we have an IMM boolean. Go ahead and select that, and then up here you're gonna see a holes brush you can select. If you go ahead and just drag this on your mesh, it'll probably do a fine job, but one thing you can do is you can go over here to brush modifiers. You're going to see there's a projection strength. So if you crank that up to 100, you're going to see your IMM brush will follow the curvature of your mesh. So that's a cool thing. Now, if we want to Boolean these objects, what we have to do is when we drag this out, it's automatically unmasked. So all we need to do is go in here to split, unmask points. That's going to split this holes object into its own subtool. Then we can turn this to subtractive. We can turn on live Boolean. We'll turn off polyframe. And now you can see we have a Boolean mesh. Now it's a live Boolean, so I can hit W and I can move, scale, or rotate this around however I want. But in order to apply this Boolean, I have to go down here like we've done before and say Boolean, make Boolean mesh. Before I do that though, I want access to polygroups. So if I turn on my polyframe here and go into solo mode, you're gonna see these are all the same polygroup. So before we apply this, let's go down here to polygroups and we're gonna do a group by normal. Again, it's gonna look at that normal angle and go, okay, any sharp normal change, I'm gonna put a new polygroup on that surface. So now we have green and pink and yellow on all different sides here. So let's go out of solo mode and we'll go out of polyframe mode. And with these two visible and with live Boolean turned on, We can now go down here to Boolean, make Boolean mesh. That's going to create a UMesh out here. So when we select this one and then hit polyframe, you're going to see that's the Boolean result. So now, if we look at our polygroups, and again, Bevel Pro is driven by polygroups. It's going to put a bevel wherever there is a polygroup border. However, you can also control this with masking. So for example, if I just want to bevel this row of circles right here, or holes cut in, I can hold down Control Shift. We have select rectangle selected. I'm going to Control Shift click this. Any one of these polygroups, Control Shift drag to invert that selection. And I'm just going to go through here quickly. And if you tap between two polygroups, it'll grab both of them and get rid of all those. So, and it's visibility, they're not deleted, but now what I can do is I can control tap in my document to mask everything that's visible, Control Shift tap to bring everything back, and you're going to see these are now unmasked. So when I go into Bevel Pro now, so again, we'll go back up to ZPlugin, Bevel Pro, move this into place. You can see it's ignoring everything except that was things that were unmasked. Now this bevel is pretty big, so I'm going to go to this bevel amount here and we'll just say maybe 0.1. And there we go. We got a nice, much tighter bevel in here. We can do our preview edges. We can click auto apply, and there you can see that result we're going to get. And that's going to put that bevel right along that bottom. However, what if you also wanted that top lip? So if we cancel out of this, the way we masked this didn't give us any wiggle room up here. So all this red is basically masks. So this time what we're going to do is hold down Control Shift, select this polygroup, Control Shift drag to invert. We're going to go through here and we're going to hide all these. Now this time I'm going to Control Shift drag. All these are showing. I'm going to Control tap to mask this. And now when I mask this, all these top verts are going to be masked. So when I Control Shift tap to bring everything else back, and then Control tap in my document to invert that mask, those are now going to be unmasked. So it's going to unmask that border along the top. So now it's going to recognize the polygroup border here and the polygroup border up at the top. And in fact, if I go down here, all the hotkeys I'm doing, Control tapping and Control Shift tapping, can be controlled in here. Here's inverse, mask all that good stuff. So now if I go back in here to Bevel Pro, and we look at this result, you're going to see it kept my bevel setting. So I got the 0.1 in there. I'm going to go in here and say auto apply just so I can see the bevel result. And up here at the top, they're getting a little bit close together. So I'm going to take this bevel amount and we're going to say maybe 0.05. Maybe I'll take this mesh resolution down to 2. There we go. So there's my bevel result. Again, it's only looking at areas that are unmasked. So we're going to hit OK. And there we go. We had auto apply turned on. So it goes ahead and bevels that for us. So we go back to startup material, turn on polyframe. There we go. We have a nice bevel on just those unmasked areas. Now, I've showed you the live Boolean result on a Dynamesh object, but this kind of goes hand in hand with one of the things you usually want to do when you're beveling or you're Booleaning and you want to put a bevel on it. So we'll go in here to the Cube 3D. We'll go ahead and say Make Polymesh 3D. We're going to hit Control D a bunch of times. I'm going to duplicate this off. We're going to move this out. We're going to scale this down. Maybe scale it in. I'll scale it out a little bit here. I'm going to drag this up, hold down Control and drag this down. Oops. Let's go down here to Geometry, delete lower, Control drag this down, and then we'll just keep repeating this. Control drag to unmask. Go over here, set this to subtractive. Now we have a live Boolean being punched into our mesh here. And in fact, you know, I had to change my mind. Let's go ahead and scale this in. So we know when we apply this Boolean, we're going to have a border, or a polygroup border around here. We can't bevel that just yet, but if we go down here to Geometry, Subtool, Make Boolean Mesh, that'll go ahead and generate our UMesh here. And because, again, we have polygroups around these two edges, we can go hop right back into Bevel Pro. You can crank up this bevel amount. And we'll go ahead and turn off preview edges, turn on auto apply so we can see the result of that Boolean. And there we go. We got a nice Boolean result around all of those polygroups there. And again, with auto apply turned on, we can hit OK. Or remember, auto apply turned off, hit OK. Now you have a Boolean mesh result. And sometimes what I'll do, and I use this on my buffalo, if we just grab this UMesh, this is actually pretty cool geometry. So you can use this geometry if you want to just take that from subtractive to additive. You can use this as kind of like a liner. Pull this out a little bit, maybe inflate it, go through there, and now you have like a rubber gasket around those openings. So you can also use Boolean or Bevel Pro to add interesting geometry. And again, I guess I'll show you what I did do on the buffalo. So we're going to go in here to Cube 3D, make it a Polymesh 3D, just real quickly. I'm going to go into Skin Shader 4. We're going to turn on X symmetry by tapping X on our keyboard. Let's hold down Control Shift. We'll go in here to trim curve. Oh, I'm sorry, Control Shift. We're going here to knife curve, and we can just, cut an interesting shape with our knife brushes in here. I'm going to go down here to Geometry, ZRemesher. I'm going to tell it half, adapt the size down to 0 for nice even quads, detect edges so it picks up these sharp corners, and keep our groups, smooth groups down to 0. They're already smooth. Hit ZRemesh. We have nice, cool new geometry. And if I want to, make a cage out of this, essentially, I can go right into Bevel Pro. Let's go up here to our Bevel Amount. We'll say maybe 0.4 to thicken that up a little bit. You know what? Let's go 0.8. And it's going pretty fast because this is pretty low-res geometry. You can use Bevel Pro on high-res geometry, low-res geometry, it'll work fine. But essentially what I'm going to do is say, instead of auto-apply, which is going to apply it, we want to turn that off, go over here and hit OK. And I'm just going to use this geometry that I've created as kind of like a roll cage. So I turn off my original geometry, and there we go. We have just a cool steel cage of geometry that we can use. In fact, I can even point it down on the bison where I did use this piece right here. I just used this and I used that technique in ZRemesher and ZModeler to get that shape. Probably even used it on this one here. So instead of using this as a Boolean technique, I just used the resulting mesh as, again, kind of a scaffolding cage for my overall design. In fact, where we're talking about the bison, or the buffalo, I actually used it to do an inset on these objects here. So one way you could do it is go out of Volume Boolean, go out of edit mode, hit Control N to clear our canvas. Again, just another super quick demo. Cube 3D, drag it on our canvas, go into edit mode, make Polymesh 3D. Let's switch this here to Skin Shader 4. I'm going to go ahead and just make this a slightly different shape here, like so. And then we're just going to, we'll turn on X symmetry. There you go. So we'll thin this out in this direction. If I want nice even geometry, again, geometry, ZRemesher half, adapt size down to 0, detect edges. There we go. I'm going to hit Control D. That actually creased our edges as well. Control D a couple times, hit delete lower. Nice clean geometry on here. We can go through here and we can use knife curve to just, alt tap twice to cut through. So now we got a shape with polygroups on all sides. And if I want to, again, ZRemesh half. This time we'll say keep groups, smooth groups down to 0. ZRemesh, we'll get a ZRemesh result, but let's say I want to inset this side a little bit. So what I can do is I can Control Shift tap, Control Shift drag with select rectangle, Control W, Control Shift tap again. So now I just have polygroups on this side, and now if I go in here and say run Bevel Pro, and it's across the X symmetry here, so it's going to be on both sides, which is fine. I can go in here and again, that bevel amount, I'm going to put this all the way up to 1. And this inset amount is what I'm looking for. So if I say, I'm not going to hit auto apply, so I'm going to say OK. And if I turn out to go out of polyframe mode, this is the resulting bevel I get. You can see I probably needed to change that offset amount just a little bit to grab that extra piece. But basically what I'm looking at is I want to keep this original geometry. So I'm going to duplicate this off. But on this piece of geometry, what I really want is this inset polygroup by itself. So I'm going to turn this original one off with just these two showing. I'm going to say make Boolean mesh. That's going to put out a UMesh in here. I'm going to append it. So now I've got this UMesh. So I'm going to go into polyframe mode, just go into solo mode. I want this red inset mesh here. So Control Shift tap the red, geometry, modify topology, delete hidden. And if I want to, I can, do one more round of ZRemesh. This time I'll just say half. Adapt the size down to 0, just nice even quads. There we go, new geometry. And then these two original meshes, I'm just going to go ahead and delete these out of my scene. So really what I was looking for was our original mesh here, and then an inset mesh here that I can now go to my ZModeler brush, BZM. I can Q mesh, polygroup all, pull out a little bit of thickness, push this in a little bit, and again we have X symmetry turned on, so we'll tap X on our keyboard if we want to push in from both sides. There we go. And again, if I turn this into a live Boolean, turn off polyframe, you're going to see we basically now have an inset geometry here that we can use as a live Boolean. So not only can you use Bevel Pro to create Booleans, you can also use Bevel Pro to create nice insets from just arbitrary geometry. And really, just to finish this up, here's what I actually did this for, was for lightweighting. So Control Shift, grab the knife curve, Control Shift, hold down the spacebar, do brush radius, make your brush size so that when you go through and then hold down Alt, you can go through and like cut. And actually I should probably we'll go to the corners here, and then maybe one across here. So again, Control Shift, drag, and then hold down Alt before you let go. That'll cut in pieces. So now when I go through here, we have just a little bit of a lightweighted result. And I'm just going to interject here. Of course, you can apply this Boolean, go back into Bevel Pro, bevel those Boolean edges. You know, it's Booleans all the way down. Now again, just so you can follow along, I'm going to go back into our sphere ender 3D shape that we made it earlier. Basically, we just have the initialized shape down here underneath the initialize with the coverage turned down to 270. We went up here, and you know what? While we're in here, let's go ahead and increase the spans along the top. With our V divide, we'll go ahead and crank that up. So now we're going to go back up here to our Make Polymesh 3D. We're going to go back down here to our polygroups, and we're going to say group by normals. So all of those angles get grouped. But let's say you have maybe a polygroup up here. We'll hit Control W. I'm just going to hold down Control and mask. We'll have a polygroup here. We'll hit Control W and mask. And we go into Bevel Pro. You can see everything's working as normal, but it is picking up those polygroups here. However, just like when we were doing polygroup by normal angle, it's going to look at, if we turn on auto apply here, it's going to create a polygroup based on the angle. So we had a really sharp angle here, and then even over here, it was fairly sharp angle, but on these up here, not very sharp angles. You see this is a very soft stroke, or very soft fall offs around these edges right here. So we can actually, if we turn off auto apply, we can clean these up. Instead of going through and masking where we want, we can literally tell it, hey, this polygroup angle, just take this slider and just pull it up just a tiny bit. I turn it up to like 0.05, just a little bit will do it, and it'll go ahead and get rid of those. So it's going to look at the angles of your object, and if it has a very shallow angle in here, not a whole lot of change in form going on, it'll go ahead and mask those areas out for you. Not literally mask, just ignore it essentially. And then of course you're ready to go. We can turn on auto apply, everything's looking good, hit OK. And again, it basically, Bevel Pro ignored these shallow angle areas there. And just back to our original mesh here, we're going to do a really sharp cut. So I'm going to go in here and append a cube 3D, and we're going to take this cube and we're going to move it out here. We're going to scale it down this direction, scale it up in this direction so we can get a nice clean slice through here. Turn this into a subtractive mesh with live Boolean turned on. So you can see we're just cutting right through this mesh here. If we like what we see, we can go down here to Subtool Boolean, Make Boolean Mesh. That'll put out this UMesh here, and you can see we've Booleaned in this mesh. Now, of course, we want to put a bevel around our polygroup, so hop into Bevel Pro. And you can see it does a really good job. We can hit auto apply, looks great. If you're ever getting anything where it's getting a little bit weird around your corners, you may have sharp turned off. Generally speaking, this is turned on by default, and I generally leave it on because what can end up happening is it'll try to give you a transition in here that may not work out that great. You can see it kind of gets a little wobbly. Let's go ahead and turn on preview edges. It doesn't do obviously it doesn't do a sharp transition, so you can turn on sharp, and that'll ensure that these cuts in here are going to get a nice sharp transition in here. It cleans up those corners on there. So if we go in here and we have auto apply turned on, we hit OK, it does a pretty good job. And we drag that back and we just go back to where we were originally. In fact, we'll go back to our original mesh here. We'll delete that cube out of our scene. So we have, you know, these polygroups. We already know these polygroups are going to work. However, if we go in here to Control Shift and we grab maybe the knife curve, sometimes these will leave behind some kind of nasty geometry. If you go through here and hold down Shift, you'll see you'll get some overlapping geo kind of in here. So one way to possibly fix that is if we go back in here to Bevel Pro and we look around at this area here. And let's go ahead and take our bevel amount down just a bit. We'll turn on auto apply. That actually did a pretty decent job. You may notice in some of these angles it may have a little bit of a hard time. You can always go in here to fix edges, and that'll go through and fix any non-manifold geometry you may have in your scene. Another thing you can try is you can come back out here, and I like to do just a quick geometry, modify topology, weld points. I'm going to crank that weld distance up just a bit. That'll go through and weld any really close points, and then when I hop back into Bevel Pro, that might clean up any results. And or you can also go down here to mesh integrity and say fix mesh, and any floating points or anything like that that may be giving Bevel Pro an issue, and I'll try and clean that up. So before you hop into Bevel Pro, welding points and then fixing your mesh may help. And there is also a fix edges in here that you can hit that may clean up any gaps that you may run into while you're using that. In this case, it seems to be doing a really stellar job, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it. We'll leave auto apply, hit OK, and there we go. We get nice clean bevels along that knife operation that we did. And I think just one last thing I want to show, just using our original mesh here, we're going to hop back into Bevel Pro. I'm going to turn on auto apply. We're going to turn on preview edges, and you're going to see, remember the mesh edge resolution, it'll go ahead and add edges. If you just dump this down to 1, go ahead and say OK. You now have a pretty clean line around here. So if you wanted to, you can go into BZM to your Z modeler brush, hover over an edge, insert, multiple edge loops, interactive elevation, and you can just click and pull on here and round out. Click and pull on here and just round out some of these edges here. So depending on how your polygroups are set up, you can go back in and get kind of a fillet result. Just coming back in with Z modeler and adding that manually. Again, using, and you could even go the other way if you wanted to, insert multiple edge loops, interactive elevation. You could even push in, you know, and kind of fillet it inwards. So just a little bit of extra functionality for you if you needed to come back in. Remember that Z modeler is available to you, and polygroups here if you want to, you know, frame this mesh with a curved brush or whatever. That's another option. Actually, there's one more thing I completely forgot to show. So we're going to grab a cube, drag it on our canvas here. Let's go ahead and say make polymesh 3D. Let's go in here to geometry, dynamic subdivision. I'm going to turn on dynamic, smooth subdiv down to 1. I'm going to use Q grid, so I'm going to increase that a little bit. We're going to change this from bevel to chamfer. We're going to kind of smooth our edges out a little bit. And then we go in here to subtool. I'm going to duplicate this off. I'm going to move this up. I'm going to scale it down, and I'm going to set this to subtractive with live Boolean turned on so we can kind of punch in a shape. So if I turn on polyframe, you see this is the result we're going to get. Now, one more thing, this is dynamic, so we can toggle this on and off. Shift D and D toggles dynamic on and off. However, if we are going to Boolean these together and want to keep those nice soft corners, we need to go in here to Boolean, say dynamic subdivision. Make sure that's turned on, so when we make the Boolean mesh, it'll apply those, and then our UMesh will have those built in. Now, when we go in here and we go back into ZPlugin, and we check out our Bevel Pro, drag this in here, you're going to see this is where our bevels are going to pick up. Let's go ahead and number 1, this bevel amount, let's crank this up to maybe 0.35. I'm going to turn on auto apply. And this is an instance because these are all smooth that sharp probably isn't going to have much of an effect. It doesn't really need to watch out for any sharp transitions. However, one thing you can do is you can go in here to Bevel Smoothness, and it looked like I had a small amount dialed in there by default, but if I crank this up, it'll go through and you can see how it kind of rounded that out even more. Essentially, it's going through and smoothing out your Boolean mesh. So if that's useful to you, if you're ever getting anything on your bevel that you want to smooth out, remember Bevel Smoothness is in there. And again, you can hit OK. It'll apply that bevel for you. And there's the end result there. Nice and smooth and beveled.